Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm bringing you a story centered around CEO James and Diep. It's a story that begins quietly and gently, nothing dramatic, nothing unusual, yet it becomes the foundation for events even they never could have anticipated. In this episode, Diep saves a life and decides to take in a baby boy. So how exactly did everything unfold? Let's follow today's story together. That afternoon, for James and Diep, felt no different from countless others before it. There were no urgent phone calls, no warning signs, no strange instincts telling them that their calm and stable life was about to turn in an entirely new direction. Everything began with the simplest, most familiar moments, just like many life-changing stories do. Diep finished work earlier than usual that day. After selling the last of her vegetables, she packed up her stall, locked everything carefully, and headed toward the nearby kindergarten to pick up Nee. Nee was their 4-year-old adopted daughter, who had been living with James and Diep for a long time now, becoming an inseparable part of their small family. For Diep, picking Nee up every afternoon had become a gentle routine, familiar, comforting, and quietly reassuring. As the kindergarten gates opened, children were gradually reunited with their parents. Among the small figures, Diep quickly spotted Nee. The little girl ran toward her, her tiny backpack bouncing behind her, cheeks flushed from the sun and an afternoon full of play. Her face was lightly damp with sweat, but her eyes lit up the moment she saw Diep. "Mom, the teacher praised me today," Nee said excitedly as she climbed into the car, her voice filled with pride, as if she had just accomplished something truly great. Diep smiled and gently ran her hand through Nee's hair. It wasn't a big or flashy smile, just a familiar, warm one, but her eyes reflected a very real sense of pride. For Diep, moments like this made all the fatigue of the day quietly fade away. The afternoon sunlight wasn't harsh. Soft golden rays stretched across the road, filtering through the slightly open car window. A light breeze carried the rare coolness of late afternoon, creating a sense of calm that was difficult to put into words. It was the kind of feeling that made one want to slow down, to linger just a little longer before returning to everyday responsibilities. On the way home, Diep stopped by a familiar convenience store. She bought a few cartons of milk and some snacks for Nee, simple treats that always made the little girl happy. When Diep returned to the car, Nee was already sitting properly in the back seat, holding her snack, chewing slowly while letting out a long yawn, her eyelids growing heavy with sleep. "Mom, I'm so sleepy," Nee murmured, her voice trailing off with childlike exhaustion. Diep glanced at her through the rearview mirror, her expression softening. She didn't rush to start the car right away. Instead, she spoke gently. "Let's walk a little to enjoy the breeze, then we'll go home and sleep." Nee nodded faintly, almost as if she was afraid a bigger movement might chase the sleep away. She took Diep's hand and stepped out of the car, her small feet touching the familiar road near their home. Mother and daughter walked along a narrow, tree-lined path. This was the road Diep often chose whenever she wanted to clear her mind, to step away briefly from the noise of life. It wasn't a busy street, quiet enough that they could hear their footsteps against the ground, the soft rustle of dry leaves stirred by the breeze. The last light of the day filtered through the canopy above, casting gentle patterns of light and shadow across the road. Everything felt slow, calm, and unhurried. Nee walked beside Diep, her hand still held tightly, occasionally squeezing as if out of habit. Diep could feel the warmth of that small hand, real, close, grounding, and without realizing it, she relaxed her pace even more. At that moment, everything was so peaceful that neither of them could have imagined that shortly afterward, this seemingly ordinary afternoon would become a turning point, one that opened the door to events they were never prepared to face. The two of them continued walking slowly along the narrow, tree-lined road. Their steps were steady and unhurried, as if the world around them had also slowed to match their pace. Nee lightly kicked at the dry leaves along the edge of the path as she walked, her small shoes brushing against them, creating soft rustling sounds. From time to time, she looked up and asked Diep random questions, about dinner, about a game she had played in class, her childish voice echoing gently through the quiet road. Diep listened to her daughter while allowing her mind to relax. The fatigue of the day seemed to drift away, replaced by a rare sense of calm. Her hand held Nee's tightly, feeling the warmth and familiarity of that small grip, something steady and real amid the busyness of life. Suddenly, Diep stopped. It wasn't because of a clear thought or a distinct sound. It was a vague, hard-to-name sensation that caused her steps to halt completely. Nee, distracted by the leaves, almost bumped into her mother and quickly stopped as well. A very faint sound came from the bushes along the side of the road. Weak, broken, so fragile it could easily be mistaken for the wind slipping through the leaves. But it wasn't the wind. There was something uneven about it, trembling, struggling to exist, as if it might fade away at any moment. "Mom?" Nee looked up, realizing her mother had stopped. She followed Diep's gaze, beginning to sense that something was wrong. Diep didn't answer right away. She held her breath, tilting her head slightly, straining to listen. The surroundings suddenly felt quieter than ever. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the soft breeze, all seemed to retreat, giving way to that fragile sound. Then it came again. This time, it was clearer. No longer vague. A trembling, broken sound, carrying a terrifying weakness. It was crying. A very faint, infant's cry, as if all strength had been drained, yet the child was still forcing out the last bits of sound to call for help. Not the loud cry of a healthy baby, but a sound so delicate it made the listener instinctively hold their breath, afraid that any sudden movement might cause it to disappear. Diep's heart tightened. A chill ran down her spine while her chest grew unbearably heavy. Without realizing it, her hand gripping Nee's tightened slightly. "Nee, stay here. Don't move," Diep said softly. Her voice no longer carried its earlier calm, it was low, tense, unmistakably strained. Nee obediently stopped beside a stone bench along the road. She didn't ask any more questions, only stared at her mother with wide eyes, her gaze filled with innocent worry. A child's instinct told her something was wrong, even if she couldn't fully understand it. Diep moved slowly toward the bushes. Each step felt heavier than usual. She tried to be as quiet as possible, afraid of disturbing whatever lay ahead. Her hands trembled slightly as she brushed aside layers of dry leaves and weeds. The leaves rustled softly against each other, making her heart race faster. The closer she got, the clearer the crying became. No longer distant or uncertain, but weakly echoing in the stillness, like a lonely plea for help on an empty road. And then, Diep froze. Beneath the dried leaves lay a baby boy, about 4 to 5 months old, curled into himself, so small it made her throat tighten just looking at him. His tiny body was drawn inward, as if instinctively trying to protect himself from the cold and the loneliness. His skin was flushed, dotted with insect bites that stood out painfully against his fragile frame. His clothes were dirty and damp, clinging with soil and dry leaves, as though he had been lying there for an unknown length of time. His lips trembled continuously, and his breathing was so weak that Diep had to lean in close just to feel it. Each breath was like a thin thread, making her afraid to breathe too deeply herself, as if she might break it. "Oh my God," Diep whispered, her trembling hand covering her mouth. In that moment, her mind went almost completely blank. There were no clear thoughts, no plans, only a rush of panic and heartbreak tightening her throat. The scene before her was far too sudden, far too cruel compared to the peaceful afternoon that had just passed. Not daring to waste another second, Diep quickly lifted the baby into her arms. She pressed him close to her chest, wrapping both arms around his tiny body to keep him warm. He was colder than she had expected, the chill seeping through her clothes and straight into her heart. He was so light, unbearably light, that it felt as though she were holding something that could vanish at any moment. The crying remained faint, reduced to tiny sounds escaping with each fragile breath. Diep lowered her gaze to his delicate face, a vague yet overwhelming fear swelling inside her. From a distance, Ni watched. She hesitated for a few seconds before stepping a little closer, not daring to come too near. Her voice was small, filled with a mix of fear and childlike curiosity. "Mom, what's wrong with the baby?" Diep continued holding the baby tightly, her eyes never leaving his tiny face. In that moment, the entire road seemed to fall silent, leaving only the baby's fragile breathing and the pounding of Diep's heart, signaling that the ordinary afternoon they had known was truly gone. "The baby is lost, sweetheart. Mom has to take him to the hospital right away," Diep said quickly, trying to keep her voice from trembling. Even as she forced herself to sound calm, she could clearly feel her heart pounding wildly in her chest. One arm held the baby boy tightly against her body, while her other hand clasped Ni's, gripping a little harder than usual, as if to make sure her daughter was still right there beside her. At that moment, Diep's mind held no complicated thoughts, only a single, urgent instinct: she had to get this baby to safety as fast as possible. Diep called for a car in a state of urgency. When it arrived, she got in first with the baby, helped Ni sit close beside her, then quickly followed in herself. As the car door closed, it cut them off from the quiet little road they had just left behind, but the tension clinging to Diep did not ease in the slightest. Inside the car, Diep barely took her eyes off the baby's face. She gently patted his back in slow, steady rhythms, a natural reflex she didn't even have to think about. Her lips moved in faint whispers of reassurance, words so soft it was unclear whether they were meant for the baby or for herself. Each time she felt his weak but steady breathing continue, her heart tightened, then loosened again for a brief moment. Ni sat close to her mother, leaning slightly toward her despite resting against the seat. She didn't cry, and she didn't ask any more questions. Her young eyes stayed fixed on the baby in her mother's arms, filled with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and instinctive compassion. There were many things Ni couldn't yet understand, but she could clearly sense that this baby was very weak and desperately in need of help. The drive to the hospital felt longer than usual. Every passing minute weighed heavily on Diep. She glanced out the window, then looked back down at the baby, silently wishing the car would arrive faster. As soon as the car stopped at the hospital entrance, Diep almost flung the door open and stepped out. Holding the baby tightly, she called out for help. Doctors and nurses appeared quickly, and with just a brief look at the baby's condition, they immediately rushed him into the emergency room. The moment the emergency room doors closed, Diep froze. Just seconds ago, the baby had been in her arms. Now he lay beyond that cold, closed door. The hospital hallway was brightly lit, white, sterile, and eerily quiet. The stillness only made the worry in Diep's chest feel heavier, more suffocating. Ni stood close beside her, her small hand tightly gripping Diep's, as if afraid that letting go would cause everything to slip away. She looked up at her mother, eyes shimmering, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, will the baby be okay?" Diep bent down and pulled her daughter into her arms. She hugged Ni tightly, pressing her cheek against her shoulder. Too many emotions surged at once, leaving Diep unable to answer right away. Her throat tightened, she could only shake her head slightly, a reflex more than a response. She didn't know what to say, and she didn't dare make promises when she herself was filled with uncertainty. Time in the hospital corridor crawled by, unbearably slow. Each second felt longer than the last. Diep stood still, eyes locked on the emergency room door, ears strained for any sound from inside. Nee leaned against her mother, occasionally glancing at the door before lowering her gaze again, unusually quiet compared to her normally lively self. Finally, the door opened. A doctor stepped out, removing his mask, his expression calm and composed. The moment Diep saw him, she instinctively stepped forward, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. "You brought him in just in time," the doctor said evenly. "He was mildly dehydrated and malnourished, but he's out of danger now." In that instant, it felt as though a massive weight had been lifted from Diep's chest. The breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding finally escaped. Tears slipped down her face without warning, not from fear anymore, but from a mix of relief and aching sorrow. Hearing the doctor's words, Nee's eyes widened briefly before softening. She let out a small breath, as if she, too, had just gone through something far bigger than her age could fully grasp. She hugged her mother tighter, her small arms wrapping around Diep as she sought the familiar sense of safety. Not long afterward, the police arrived at the hospital to document the incident. Diep did her best to remain calm as she recounted everything that had happened, from hearing the faint crying by the roadside, to discovering the baby beneath the bushes, and bringing him to the hospital. Each detail brought back a wave of the initial shock, but she forced herself to speak clearly and steadily. The officers took careful notes, exchanged brief words with one another, and informed her that they would begin searching for the baby's family. However, at that moment, there were still no leads regarding the baby boy's identity or relatives. Diep listened quietly, one hand resting on Nee's shoulder in a protective habit. Inside her, an unnameable feeling slowly took shape, part worry, part heaviness, as she looked toward the hospital room where the baby lay, realizing that this story was far from over, and that many unanswered questions still lingered ahead. They named the baby boy Ben. The name was spoken softly, no ceremony, no grand declaration, yet it carried a strange sense of closeness. When it was said aloud for the first time in the small house, Diep glanced at James, and James looked down at the baby in his arms. Neither of them said another word, but the agreement in their eyes was unmistakable. Ben, a short, simple name, easy to call, as if this child had somehow already belonged here. From the day Ben arrived, James and Diep's home began to change, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. These weren't dramatic changes, but small details that gradually wove themselves into everyday life. Mornings were no longer completely silent. A baby's soft cry would rise, faint at first, then clearer, waking the entire house. Afternoons and evenings no longer followed their old familiar rhythm, interrupted instead by the gentle, fragile sounds of a new life. Nee was the first to sense these changes. She became a big sister naturally, as if the role had always been waiting inside her. Every day, she ran to the small crib, leaning over it for long moments, watching Ben's tiniest movements. Sometimes she giggled when he stirred, other times she became unexpectedly serious, placing her hand on the crib rail and speaking in a grown-up tone. "Ben, you have to be good, okay? So your big sister can play with you." Her words made Diep both smile and feel deeply moved. Watching the two children, one older, one so small, Diep felt a warmth she couldn't quite put into words. The house, once home to only 3 people, now held one more tiny presence. Yet it didn't feel crowded at all. Instead, it felt fuller. James, too, changed in his own way. He had always lived by a fast, orderly rhythm. But since Ben came home, James found himself relearning the most basic things. He fumbled with preparing milk, carefully rereading the instructions again and again. At times, he held the baby awkwardly, his arms stiff with fear of hurting someone so small. During those first nights, James stayed awake with Diep, sitting quietly beside her when Ben cried, learning a kind of exhaustion very different from work-related pressure. Old habits slowly faded. Daily schedules were no longer fixed. Quiet evenings were replaced by soft lights and whispered reassurances. Life became busier, messier, but also warmer in a very real way. No one said it out loud, but both James and Diep understood one thing clearly: Ben hadn't only been saved. His presence had also, unintentionally, filled small empty spaces they themselves had never named. This home, in a quiet way, was becoming more complete than ever. And yet, deep inside Diep, there were still moments of silence that belonged only to her. There were nights when the house had long fallen asleep, and Diep remained by the crib, quietly watching Ben sleep. His face looked peaceful then, his breathing steady and light. Each time she watched him like that, thoughts she had never spoken to anyone would rise within her. Did he truly have no family left? Or somewhere out there, was someone still searching, still aching, still carrying a past Ben knew nothing about? These questions didn't make Diep regret her decision, but they lingered quietly, like gentle ripples beneath calm water. She understood that some things couldn't be avoided forever. Even though Ben was here now, loved and cared for, his past was still a part of him, something that couldn't simply be erased. And if one day, the truth were to finally come to light, would Ben be taken away from this place? Would James and Diep be able to face what they had no power to choose? Would Nee, the big sister who already saw Ben as family, be able to understand and accept what lay ahead? Those questions remained unanswered, hanging silently between a peaceful present and an uncertain future. Stay tuned for the next episode to continue following the story of CEO James, Diep, little Nee, and baby Ben.
Chào tất cả mọi người đã quay trở lại với kênh của mình nhé. Hôm nay mình rất là buồn. Hôm nay mình buồn đến cái mức mà mình không muốn làm video luôn. Cái gì mọi người donate cho mình đỡ buồn, nhưng mọi người chắc không hiểu mình nói gì hết. Mình buồn, mình không biết có tiếp tục làm video để cho mọi người xem nữa hay không. Mình buồn quá. Mà cái gì nó cũng đau hết đó ta. Cảm ơn mọi người đã theo dõi video của mình nhé. Tạm biệt mọi người. Hẹn gặp lại mọi người ở những